기조강연은요, 이화여자대학교 국제대학원 김은미 교수님께서 준비를 해주셨는데요. 지속가능한 발전을 위한 글로벌 노력입니다. UN 지속가능한 발전 목표 UN SDGs에 대해서 기조강연 해주시겠습니다. 교수님 단상으로 모시도록 하겠습니다. 네, 여러분 큰 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
Good morning. It's a great honor and privilege to be standing here in front of you to talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I had the honor of representing Korea on the UN's Global Sustainable Development Report 2019 that was just released. So it's a real honor and privilege to be here to engage with you to talk about the significance of what we in Asia should be doing for the future. First of all, I would like to start with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think this audience knows very well what the Sustainable Development Goals are. The two very important mottos are leave no one behind, and although I didn't include it, it's we have one earth. So these are very important messages about the people and the environment. The nickname is Agenda 2030 that we often refer to. There's 17 goals compared to the Millennium Development Goals where we had only 8. So my students have a really hard time memorizing all 17. There are several different ways to make it a little bit easier. We can do People P of the goals that were still there in the Millennium Development Goals to help with human development, like end poverty, hunger, educate children, provide gender equality, and focus on health issues. In the Sustainable Development Goals, we included 2 more developmental issues. The second is economic development. In addition to human development and social development, it was very critical once you had a job, once you were well, you needed a place to go to help do work. So the Sustainable Development Goals have some very interesting and important goals on economic growth and economic development. But it's not just economic growth for the sake of economic growth, but it's sustainable economic growth so that this economic growth will provide good jobs, decent jobs for everyone. It's going to be in livable cities, and it's going to be not hurting the environment like our past development efforts were focused on. So the Sustainable Development Goals has social development, economic development, and finally, environmentally sustainable development. As many of the presenters and keynote speakers have already addressed, environment, climate change are really, really critical at a cutting point at this time. If we don't act now, we may not have this earth to live on. So Sustainable Development Goals with all 17 goals, and I would like to highlight goals 16 and 17. 16 is peace and security that really doesn't belong in poverty and environmental discussions. But it was very critical that we included an item on war and peace because it was very evident. As you go around developing countries, the poorest countries are the same ones that are suffering from war and conflict. If you are in war and conflict, your poverty becomes intergenerational poverty. You're not able to get out of it. So although these are very difficult problems, it was very critical that we engage both poverty and peace issues together in order to tackle sustainable development goals. Finally, goal number 17, like the Millennium Development Goals, number 8th goal, it's about global partnership. We can't do this alone. We can't let the developing countries do this alone. We can't let the developed countries not worry about their own people who may have fallen through the cracks through inequality. So the Sustainable Goals, goal number 17 says, we all must work together. There's nobody outside of this conundrum. We all have to work together. Let me move to the Global Sustainable Development Report that I had the privilege of working. The UN member states had requested an independent and critical council to assess the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. So the Global Sustainable Development Report was to be done every 4 years. 15 scientists from around the world will be appointed by the UN Secretary General. I was honored to be on the first panel. We started our commission was appointed on the last day of then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's tenure at the UN. So I got a letter from him dated December 31st, 2016, and we began our work immediately in 2017. Until last month, we worked very hard, and we were trying to put together a report that was more science-based. Everybody noted the Sustainable Development Goals were a result of political negotiations at the United Nations. They wanted researchers to bring the scientific evidence to bear upon these 17 goals to see where there could be co-benefits and trade-offs, especially to avoid the trade-offs. So they wanted us to look at the interactions among the different goals. The goal was to present a blueprint for the world until 2030, Agenda 2030, but also to 2050 and beyond, so that we can live peacefully and safely in this world, but our future generations will also have a chance. This is the independent group of scientists who were appointed by the UN Secretary General. The two at the top are the co-chairs, Edna and Peter Messely from Switzerland, Edna from Indonesia. The 15 of us represent different regions, different academic disciplines, and so on. I'm on the second page. So all 15 of us met together at least a couple of weeks a year in an intensive workshop, and we participated in the writing. What we took inspiration is the 1987 really historic document called the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which was published in 1987. It was sobering to see that in 2017, when we began the work, 30 years after Our Common Future, we decided to read Our Common Future again to see if the messages had been heard and that they were followed through. Surprisingly, to our chagrin, we found that Our Common Future's messages were still alive, that the concern about environment and economic development clashing with each other, environment degradation, and usage of natural resources without thinking there is a finite limit were all still true in 2017. So with a great alarm, we read Our Common Future again and hoped to publish something that would follow and be inspired by Our Common Future, but present a step forward. This is how we worked. After we were appointed in 2016, we started our work in 2017, and for 2.5 years, in 2017, we gathered in New York to try to understand what the mandate was. Why did the member states ask for an independent report? They thought it was very critical that although UN was a very credible body and producing their own reports, they wanted a critical and independent assessment by scientists so that we can bring scientific evidence to bear upon the Sustainable Development Goals. Another sort of privilege that we had is it was not to go through the usual UN vetting process. That meant that we had a pretty much free hand in doing research and providing the results back to the UN in 2019. In 2017, we had the first member states briefing. Member states who had mandated and given us the funding to do this wanted to know what we were doing. So we had the first member state meeting. We held a workshop in New York, but also in Helsinki, Finland, and we continue to receive inputs from external scholars, NGOs, governments, and whatnot. 2018, we quickly moved to a zero draft. We continued our consultations in regional UN settings, I participated in UNSCAP in Bangkok a few times to address what we were doing at the UN, but also engaging the local communities and regional communities to understand what the complexities of this life in Asia and Pacific were in other places around the world. In 2019, we did a third member state meeting. We did another regional consultation in Jordan, the Middle East, and we presented our final document to the UN in September. So this is the final report. I brought a copy. This is the final report that we produced in 2.5 years. The future is now Science for Achieving Sustainable Development. It was officially presented to the UN Secretary General on September 10. It was released on September 11th, and on September 24th at the UN General Assembly, we had the honor of presenting to the heads of state. These are some photos. This is our meeting with the UN Secretary General on September 10th. That was my birthday, so I forego my birthday for a UN meeting, and I thought it was very worthwhile. And then, this is another photo. This is from September 24th. This is at the UN General Assembly, where we're 4 of us from our group were presented with an opportunity to do a really quick fire chat. So we're able to highlight some of the key findings from our report, and were received really well. Now, let me turn to our key findings and the key arguments that we produced in our report. First of all, like Professor Jeremy Rifkin and others have said, we had to sound the alarm bell. There's only 11 years left, or about 10 years left until 2030, when we have to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. Many of the goals are on track, many are not on track, we're too slow, but what was surprisingly problematic was there are about 4 areas in which we're going actually backwards. So direction is backwards. The first one is climate change mitigation. As many have spoken earlier, climate change mitigation is too slow and is going backwards. Second, biodiversity. We're going backwards in terms of preserving our biodiversity. It's decreasing. Third, it's rising inequalities around the world. Instead of moving forward with poverty reduction and reduction in inequality, inequality has actually risen in many parts of the world in alarming rates. Finally, ecological waste is going beyond what the natural environment can absorb. We're putting away too much waste in the environment so that the environment is not able to handle it properly. We are very aware of the plastic crisis in the oceans, in our animals and fish underwater and so on. So these ecological footprint is at a stage that we really need to turn it around in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are some graphs that show you with numbers and figures what we mean by biodiversity loss, climate change, rising inequalities. We do believe that Sustainable Development Goals, one of the first things that we did is revisit the Sustainable Development Goals and see if these are a set of credible goals that we should aspire to accomplish. We took nothing for granted. In our first months, we discussed what was happening in the world. We were noticing the rising inequalities. We're understanding that the Sustainable Development Goals was probably one last chance in our very precious time left to be able to encompass all the different challenges that we face around the world to make a real difference in a tangible way. So we firmly reaffirmed that Sustainable Development Goals is what we had to achieve by 2030. Time is running short. one of the first things that we also did is you understand that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are not to be cherry-picked. Governments are not, should not cherry-pick, oh, I'm going to work on goal number 1 and goal number 5. No, the 17 goals should be taken as a whole and should be undertaken in an interactive manner as much as possible. So the first thing that we did is to try to understand the interaction between the 17 goals. What we saw in this show, in this graph is the blue dots or blue circles show that there is a positive correlation. So there is opportunity to see co-benefits among these different goals. But unfortunately, there are some that are showing in reds. The reds show that there are trade-offs. So if we try to achieve zero hunger in goal number 2, we may have consequences in the environment. We may have consequences in using too much, losing biodiversity or soil degradation, as well as greater food waste. So we're looking at some of these negative trade-offs that exist, and this helped us understand how we are trying to attain the SDGs in an integrated manner. The empty cells doesn't mean there's no relationship. It means that the scientific community has not done enough research on these topics. So this is one of the important results that we present from our report. Our report does suggest that we have to move away from silo thinking to system thinking. It was very critical that in order for us to deal with trade-offs and increase co-benefits or synergies, turning vicious cycles into virtuous cycles of poverty reduction and saving the environment, we must think as systems. And I will present you some 6 entry points for systemic transformation in a few slides later. As Professor Jeremy Rifkin has also presented to you earlier this morning, we find that we're living in a world that has rapidly changing in the last couple of decades, more so than whatever happened hundreds or 200 years ago. So we're living in a period where the changes are so rapid and profoundly complex. As you can see from many of these tables, graphs, we're living in a hyper-connected world, and the change has been very concentrated in the last couple of decades. That means there are great challenges, but I also think these provide us with great opportunities. So if we work together in a very clever way, we will be able to tackle and achieve sustainable development goals. So I think these graphs show great challenges, but also great opportunities for us to work together. Let me share with you another insight from our report. We found that although we have a common global goal of sustainable development goals, where we live, where we work, make a difference. Living in Korea in 2019 is very different from someone living in 2019 in Papua New Guinea, someone living in South Africa, someone living in Gambia, and so on. So we understand that we have a common goal, but we have to understand the complexities and the differences, stark differences of realities that we have in our local communities and our countries. So what we're saying with our report is that global commons, global goals, very important, but we have to contextualize it and tailor-make it to fit the realities of your community, of your country. This final slide presents you, it's kind of darkened, so it's not very easy to see, but moving away from silo thinking to system thinking, we presented 6 entry points for transformation. These are 6 systemic entry points where we're able to see how the sustainable development, all 17 can be implemented. We're looking at human well-being and capabilities, the energy system, the food system, urban peri-urban development. So what we're saying, for example, in food system, if we take the food system, you can take it from production, to consumption, and to waste. So all of the 17 goals could be understood. We can understand how many women are participating in agricultural production versus men, who make the decision to sell your produce in the market, and this and that. We also presented the 4 levers. What are the ways, mechanisms that we can generate change that are transformative and meaningful? These are governance, economy and finance, individual collective action, and science and technology. I'd like to highlight individual action. It's not just the collective action at the United Nations and at your national governments, but your own individual action matters. You know, a very influential girl who sat outside of the UN and outside of your doors to talk about the climate change crisis that we have on our hands. It's one individual who's making a profound difference around the world. World leaders are paying attention and addressing her because what she said as one person was significant and critical. It's the voice of the youth who is telling us, if you don't act soon, and if you don't clean up your act, we're going to be coming in and changing it, because it's their life and their future that really is what matters. So with this, this is probably the most important part of our report. I will now turn to call to action. We couldn't finish the report without coming up with some tangible policy recommendations. So the first set of call to action is we really need to have scientific evidence to bear upon your findings. So we encourage to have the Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform. And second sort of ideas for call to action, along with the third, is we need to build an open access SDG knowledge and technology platform, because we're not saying that we need to invent the wheel again. We don't need more technology, although that would be great, but what we're talking about is making it accessible, making it affordable for people in all parts of the world to be able to enjoy the fruits of science and technology to improve our lives. Another very important slide that I'd like to share is this one. When we looked at the research and development activity around the world, it was starkly different between the global north and the global south. Global north, as you may have imagined, has all the R&D funding, most of the R&D funding. What is very sparse is in the global south. This means that we really need to work very quickly to help developing countries have their own higher education, science and technology capabilities, so that they can produce their own disaggregated data, so we know where the problems are, so that we can go help tackle that problem together. This is me at the UN talking about gender. Somehow by my own volition and others, I became the champion for gender equality. In terms of rising inequality, I said it's one of the 4 that's actually going backwards in terms of sustainable development goals. Gender inequality has been persistent around the world and over centuries. And if we don't tackle gender inequality in a way that's very aggressive and assertive, we will not be able to leave no one behind and achieve sustainable development goals. What we find is that women is often the face of poverty. Women who is single with children are often the worst victims of poverty. On the other hand, women also hold the key to poverty alleviation. If we empower, educate women, they will be able to lift themselves out much better. So as recommendation, we say we must eliminate deprivations, but also build resilience through education and through empowerment. We need to invest in early childhood education and nutrition, as well as support higher enrollment in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering and mathematics with a keen eye for gender equality. And finally, to support women's groups, labor unions, civil society organizations, and other community-based organizations, so along with the central government and UN and international bodies, that they can help facilitate and work toward removing inequalities of all forms, so we could have a just society for all. This final slide, it gives you a recap of our report. First, it was an independent critical assessment of SDG implementation. We were trying to do an evidence-based research for Sustainable Development Goals. We didn't conduct our own research, but we reviewed all the academic studies that were out there. It was a meta-analysis of studies reflecting the universal, individual, integrated nature of the 2030 agenda. We were to make the policy recommendations with scientific evidence-based recommendation. So the 4 recommendations that we made is a strong message to the leaders of the UN and everyone that time is very short. We only have 10 years left until 2030. With a strong alarm, we didn't want to scare everyone and say, you know, the world is doomed. We want to come back with a message saying, perhaps there is a way to get out of this myth and transform ourselves. Although we don't have much time, we presented you with 6 systems and 4 levers that would allow us to transform in a meaningful way in the short time that we have left. The final message is we all must work together to achieve the SDGs, and it has to start now and here. Thank you very much.